What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Well, look, there's no secret that there has been a consistent and, in my opinion, insidious uh, attack by the media. Not saying it's coordinated, but I think in some instances it's coordinated. But it's just you have a group of people who are in the media who do not have an appreciation for the history of the game. They inject their own personal biases. Now, look, we all have our personal biases, but one thing I feel like people should have is an appreciation for the history of the game and a knowledge for the history of the game. These people are so arrogant that they feel like they don't need to know the history of the game. They just assume that these players are inferior because they feel that what they have watched has to be superior. What they have watched over the past 15 years, maybe 20 years, is superior. And they resent people like me and others talking about the history of the game. And they want us to just go the hell away, and revere these players that play today or the past 20 years and have them replace the legends. But one of their favorite targets is Wilt because first of all, these guys don't have any appreciation for the center position. I mean, look what the position that they phased out in the NBA. They phased out the center and the power forward, at least the traditional way that those guys play that position. They phased those players out. I mean, for God's sake, Kareem's not even in the GOAT conversation. He should be, but he's not. They phased out George Mikan to the point where he doesn't even exist anymore. We're not seeing anybody talk about him. They don't talk about Bob Pettit, and they've been shitting on Wilt Chamberlain so badly that not only has Wilt not even been part of the GOAT conversation anymore, Wilt legitimately, well, I shouldn't say legitimately, Wilt has been removed in some instances from some people's top 10. I've seen some people have Wilt top 20 at best. It almost makes me want to cry because this tells me that these people don't know what they're talking about. They don't have any knowledge of how great these players were. And I seen an article on Basketball Network, I think it's called, and I've seen it on other sites. It's an old interview where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was talking about Wilt Chamberlain. And he talked about how Wilt, for all of his greatness, Wilt had flaws. And he talked about how Wilt's mobility or lack of mobility hurt him defensively, right? And then the article talks about, how Wilt wasn't as good at boxing out as he thought he would be. And it talked about how he could get his shot off whenever he wanted to against Wilt. Wilt couldn't stop him one-on-one. And it talked about how in the games in which Wilt and Kareem played against each other, Wilt only averaged like 16 points and Kareem averaged almost 32. I think Kareem averaged like 15 rebounds, Wilt almost 18. And if you look at the article, you go like, man, see, that's what they're talking about, man. Wilt not all that. I don't know what Too Raw them are. But see, there's certain things that aren't being mentioned in that article. If you're going to shit on Wilt Chamberlain, at least tell the whole story. That's all I ask. Tell the whole story. Could you talk about how Kareem is 11 years younger than Wilt Chamberlain? Could you mention that? Could you mention that Kareem is over a decade younger than Wilt Chamberlain? And that when they were going against each other in 1970, 71, 72, Kareem was only in his early to mid 20s, whereas Wilt was in his late 30s. Could you talk about that? Could you also talk about how Wilt Chamberlain was never the same physically after suffering that devastating knee injury that still to this day is career threatening? I think it's the same injury that ended the career of Andre Roberson that played for the OKC Thunder 55 years after Wilt suffered that injury, or so I think 55, 56 years later, that injury ended Andre Roberson's career. Wilt was able to come back from that same injury within 5 months. That took sheer superhuman damn near ability to come back from that injury, but he was never the same. And he was never the same defensively. And he couldn't move the same physically. And it hurt them as far as his offensive ability because he didn't have the same quickness or lateral quickness. He lost a lot of lateral quickness. So he was not the same defender. He was a good defender, but he wasn't the lockdown defender that he had been earlier in his career. He was not as fleet of foot as he had been earlier in his career when he was 7'1", 275, 280. But at that point in time, Wilt was over 300 pounds. These things aren't being mentioned. It's also not being mentioned how, if you want to talk about somebody that Kareem dominated, bring up Dave Cowens. Look up Wilt Chamberlain's career averages versus Dave Cowens, the scrappy MVP from the 72-73 season, known for his defense. Kareem was unstoppable. Unstoppable. But I'll tell you one thing. Wilt Chamberlain, with the Los Angeles Lakers, they weren't getting knocked out in the first round every goddamn year. They didn't need a play-in tournament to give them a legitimate chance of making the playoffs. When Wilt was with the Lakers, his first year they went to the NBA Finals. His second year, they went to the NBA Finals. His third year, they went to the Western Conference Finals. His fourth year, they won the championship. And his fifth and final year, they went to the NBA Finals. Not out in the first round, not making the playoffs, bubble title, out in the first round, not making the playoffs, like somebody I know. And hell, Wilt Chamberlain himself stated unequivocally that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was the first player that he went against at that stage of his career that he needed some help to guard. He said that. He said that. But I'll tell you another thing. I've never seen another player more consistently block Kareem's skyhook than Wilt. The most unstoppable shot in the history of the game. And I'm going to say this too. For this article that's saying that, Kareem was putting up big stats against Wilt. He did. He did. But a decade, 15 years earlier, Wilt was putting up big numbers against Bill Russell. But when I mention that, or other people mention that, you say it doesn't matter. Why? Well, because Bill Russell was winning. The Celtics were winning. Well, to that I say, Wilt Chamberlain's Lakers were winning. Yes, Kareem won that one title with Oscar Robertson in 71. But for the most part, Wilt Chamberlain, who by the way, at that point in time was the third, fourth, and ultimately fifth option on offense, the Lakers were winning. So who cares if Wilt was putting up 40 points in the game? His impact, what he was doing, essentially was he was playing the Bill Russell position. He was playing like Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain. And unlike Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain could still, at times at least, in short bursts, give you a 40, 45 point game. Also, he gave you efficiency around the rim, something that Bill Russell didn't do, who was a 44% career shooter. And I'll end the video saying this. I'll always say this to Bill Russell fans, and they can never have a real legitimate answer to this. I'm not knocking Bill Russell, but this is the difference between Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain could play like Bill Russell. Defense, rebounding, passing. But Bill Russell could not play like Wilt Chamberlain. He couldn't do that. That wasn't his skill set. And that, to me, is why I say Wilt Chamberlain was a better player. Was Bill Russell more successful? Yes. His intangibles, his skills filled the role that the the Boston Celtics needed of him. But let's not forget of the great teams that Bill Russell was blessed to be around and play on. Not to mention the guy that's arguably the greatest coach of all time in Red Auerbach. I mean, it is what it is. Anyway, tell me what you guys think.